This is where you need to understand who Cruz is actually arguing with inside his own government and inside Iran's government, because both sides of this conflict have internal factions pulling in opposite directions, and Cruz's statement is aimed squarely at strengthening one faction inside Iran by weakening the other. According to open-source intelligence assessments published this week, Iran's broader military establishment, the hardline security apparatus that currently appears to dominate regime decision-making inside Tehran, is holding firm against any significant concessions on the Strait of Hormuz because it has calculated that Iran can simply outlast the United States in a war of attrition. On the other side of that internal Iranian divide sits President Masoud Pezeshkian and the pro-negotiation bloc, who are pushing hard for diplomacy specifically because Iran's economic situation is deteriorating, and they see negotiation as the only realistic path to relief. Every additional day the blockade holds, every additional round of sanctions the Treasury Department imposes, and every additional statement from a U.S. senator calling for regime collapse rather than a deal strengthens the hardline faction's argument that negotiation is pointless because Washington's actual goal was never a ceasefire, it was always the fall of the Islamic Republic itself. In other words, Cruz's comments may be intended to pressure Tehran into folding faster. But the more direct effect, according to the internal Iranian dynamics described by analysts tracking this conflict day to day, is that statements like his hand ammunition to the exact hardline factions inside Iran's government, who are already arguing that engagement with Washington is a trap. Now, layer in the sanctions picture, because this is not happening in isolation from Cruz's remarks. It is happening in the same 48 hours. The U.S. Treasury announced its 8th round of Iran-related sanctions this week, this time targeting currency exchange houses, shell companies, and financial facilitators that Washington says are helping Iran move hundreds of millions of dollars through the international financial system to fund the war effort. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent put it plainly, every facilitator that keeps the regime afloat is putting a target on its own back. At the same time, monitoring groups tracking Iranian oil exports say that since the announcement of the ceasefire memorandum back in June, at least 66 tankers have departed the Gulf of Oman, carrying Iranian oil and petrochemicals, representing roughly 80 million barrels and generating an estimated $6 billion in revenue for the IRGC. Revenue that watchdog groups say is funding Iran's missile and drone programs, even as the blockade is supposedly choking off exactly that kind of trade. So you have a blockade that is costing Iran $500 million a day by the Pentagon's own accounting, sitting right alongside a sanctions evasion network that independent monitors say is still generating billions in revenue for the regime's military wing. That contradiction, a blockade that is simultaneously devastating and porous, is exactly the kind of gap that fuels arguments like Cruz's. If the pressure campaign is not fully working, the logic goes, then the answer is more pressure, more escalation, and eventually arming the population directly to finish the job that sanctions and airstrikes have not. There's also a regional dimension to this that changes the stakes of what Cruz is proposing, and it happened literally in the same week as his comments. On August 7th, in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan signed a joint defense agreement declaring that an attack on one signatory is treated as an attack on all three. That is a mutual defense pact between 3 major regional and nuclear-adjacent powers, formalized while a live war is grinding on next door in the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia in particular has faced repeated attacks from Houthi forces in Yemen throughout this conflict. And Yemen's Houthi rebels escalated fresh attacks on Saudi-backed government troops this same week, according to Yemeni state media. What that means is that the theater Cruz is talking about arming civilians inside is not a contained, isolated conflict. It is one node in a web of alliances, proxy fights, and mutual defense commitments that now span Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, Yemen, Israel, and the United States simultaneously. Introducing an armed insurgency inside Iran, funded and equipped from outside the country, does not stay contained to Iran's internal politics. It becomes a variable that every one of those regional powers has to calculate into their own security posture, at a moment when a fresh 3-country defense pact just went into effect specifically because the region understands how fast local conflicts here can metastasize. And then there's the question nobody on that podcast asked directly, but which hangs over the entire conversation. Who exactly is running Iran's government right now, the government Cruz wants Iranian civilians to overthrow? Since the February 28th strike that killed Iran's previous supreme leader, reporting throughout this war has consistently described his successor as a figure who has barely appeared in public, governing through a fragmented and defensive chain of command rather than the centralized authority the position traditionally held. Multiple outlets covering the internal Iranian power structure this month have described a leadership vacuum at the very top of the regime, with hardline military figures effectively filling the decision-making space that a visibly absent supreme leader has left open. That detail matters enormously for evaluating Cruz's proposal, because arm the protesters to overthrow their own government assumes there is a single identifiable government to overthrow, with a clear chain of command that collapses cleanly if enough pressure is applied. What multiple intelligence assessments are actually describing is closer to a fractured, multipolar power struggle inside Tehran between a weakened diplomatic faction and an ascendant military faction, with no single figure holding the kind of consolidated authority that made the 1979 revolution, for comparison, a relatively clean transfer of power from one system to another. Introducing armed civilian resistance into that kind of fractured, already volatile internal power vacuum is far more likely to produce prolonged internal armed conflict, essentially a civil war layered on top of an active international war, than it is to produce the clean, fast collapse that the phrase regime collapse implies when you say it on a podcast in under 10 seconds. Here's the part of this that deserves the most scrutiny, and it is the part almost no coverage has pressed Cruz on directly. He explicitly said he has urged Israel, not just the United States, to arm Iranian protesters, repeatedly. That is a specific claim about specific conversations with a specific foreign government, made publicly by a sitting U.S. senator, in the middle of a war where Israel is already a direct military combatant alongside the United States. If Israel were to act on that kind of encouragement and begin directly arming an internal Iranian insurgency, that is a fundamentally different category of involvement than airstrikes against military and nuclear infrastructure. Airstrikes target the state's hard assets. Arming an internal insurgency targets the state's ability to govern its own population at all, and it does so using proxies rather than uniformed forces, which historically makes conflicts longer, messier, and far harder to end through any negotiated settlement. Because you're no longer just negotiating with a government. You're negotiating with a government while an armed internal faction that owes its weapons and its loyalty to a foreign power operates inside the same territory with its own agenda. It is August 8th, 2026, and a sitting United States senator just said the quiet part out loud on a podcast microphone, and almost nobody in the mainstream conversation is treating it with the weight it actually deserves. Ted Cruz, sitting across from CBS News national security analyst Aaron McClain on the School of War podcast, did not hedge, did not soften it, did not wrap it in diplomatic language. He said, "I think our objective should be regime collapse, not regime change, not regime pressure, regime collapse." And then he went further than that headline, because the headline alone does not capture what he actually proposed. Cruz said this, word for word: "What I believe we should do, what I have urged President Trump repeatedly, what I've urged Israel to do repeatedly, is arm the protesters, give them the guns to let them overthrow their own government so that it's not American boots on the ground, it's Iranians fighting for their own country." Sit with that sentence for a second, because it is not a throwaway line. It is a sitting United States senator, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a man who has run for president, publicly stating that he has personally and repeatedly lobbied both the President of the United States and the government of Israel to funnel weapons into the hands of Iranian civilians so they can fight their own government in the streets. This is not a hypothetical policy paper. This is a real senator describing real conversations he says he has already had with real decision makers, 6 months into a live shooting war between the United States, Israel, and Iran. And the timing of this statement is not incidental. It landed in the same week that the Trump administration is trying to close a deal with Tehran over the Strait of Hormuz, in the same week that fresh sanctions were slapped on Iran's financial networks, and in the same week that a defense pact between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan was signed in Mecca, explicitly built around the idea that an attack on one is treated as an attack on all. Cruz's comments did not happen in a vacuum. They happened at the exact moment the diplomatic track and the military track are colliding head-on, and his statement is a direct shot across the bow of the diplomats currently working the phones. This is John. If you want the version of this war that separates what's confirmed from what's noise, subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it keeps this channel independent. Now let's get into what Cruz actually said, why he's saying it now, and why arming Iranian civilians is a far more dangerous idea than it sounds like from a podcast studio in Washington. Start with where this war actually stands right now, because you cannot understand why Cruz is escalating his rhetoric without understanding the state of play on the ground. The war began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iranian military, nuclear, and government targets, an operation that also killed Iran's supreme leader in the opening hours. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point that before the war carried roughly 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of global liquefied natural gas. The United States launched a military campaign starting March 19th to force the strait back open, and by April 13th, Washington had escalated to a full naval blockade of Iranian ports, a blockade that CENTCOM says has intercepted 85 vessels, seized 3 ships outright, and is costing Iran an estimated $500 million a day. Iran, in turn, has mined the strait, boarded merchant vessels, and sunk at least 1 tugboat with more than 17 merchant ships damaged in the crossfire, and 12 seafarers killed or missing. This is not a cold standoff. This is an active, grinding maritime war that has now dragged into its 6th month, and both sides are exhausted enough that a diplomatic framework briefly took hold in June, only to collapse again by mid-July when Trump announced the ceasefire was no longer in effect and reinstated the blockade. As of this week, negotiators in Islamabad and Muscat are reportedly close to a new arrangement over shipping lanes through the strait, with Iran pushing for a configuration that keeps both inbound and outbound routes under partial Iranian territorial oversight, something Tehran insists on for its own security guarantees. But even as those talks edge toward a deal, CENTCOM confirmed just days ago that it redirected 45 commercial vessels and disabled 2 more to enforce the blockade, and an unidentified projectile struck a Greek-owned cargo ship off the Omani coast on August 3rd, setting it on fire and knocking out its power. In other words, the shooting has not stopped even while the negotiating table is supposedly close to a breakthrough. That is the environment Ted Cruz chose to stand up in and say the goal should not be a deal. The goal should be collapse. Now here's the part of Cruz's comments that most coverage is glossing over, and it is the part that actually matters most. Cruz did not invent this position on the fly for a podcast appearance. He told McClain he first pushed publicly for arming Iranian protesters back in late January, months before the war even started, after Iran's government carried out one of the most brutal crackdowns on domestic dissent in the Islamic Republic's history. Sources told CBS News that at least 12,000 people were killed in that crackdown alone. Some outlets, citing on-the-ground estimates, put the 2-day death toll from the January 8th and January 9th crackdown at more than 30,000 civilians. Whichever number you use, this was not a handful of arrests. This was a mass killing event, security forces firing into crowds of ordinary Iranians who had taken to the streets over economic collapse and political repression, weeks before a single American or Israeli bomb had been dropped. Cruz's position, in his own telling, is that the United States watched that crackdown happen and did nothing meaningful beyond statements of concern, and that this inaction is precisely what he wants to correct now, mid-war, by putting rifles into civilian hands. He is explicit that his goal in doing so is to avoid American boots on the ground, framing it as a way to let, in his words, Iranians fighting for their own country do the work instead of U.S. soldiers. On the surface, that sounds like restraint. It sounds like the opposite of the Iraq-style ground invasion that defined the last generation of American Middle East policy. But listen to what Cruz is actually describing underneath that framing, because it is not restraint. It is outsourcing a civil war. Cruz is not proposing humanitarian aid. He is not proposing sanctions relief tied to human rights benchmarks. He is proposing that the United States, and separately Israel, hand firearms to Iranian civilians with the explicit goal of having them fight and overthrow their own government. Think through what that actually requires operationally, because the mechanics matter more than the soundbite. Getting weapons into the hands of protesters inside a country that is currently under a naval blockade, currently fighting a foreign war, and currently running one of the most paranoid internal security services on the planet is not a simple logistics problem. It requires smuggling networks. It requires trusted intermediaries inside Iran who can distribute weapons without immediately being identified and executed by the IRGC's intelligence apparatus. And it requires accepting that some of those weapons will inevitably end up in the hands of people who are not peaceful pro-democracy protesters, but armed factions, ethnic separatist groups, or criminal networks who will use American or Israeli-supplied weapons for their own purposes entirely disconnected from regime change. This is the exact pattern that played out with disastrous long-term consequences in Libya, in Syria, and in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where weapons funneled in to support one faction against a government ended up fueling decades of instability, warlordism, and in some cases arming the very groups that later turned those weapons against American interests. Cruz, to his credit, acknowledged in the same conversation that the phrase regime change carries negative connotations precisely because of the comparison to the chaos that followed the U.S. toppling of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He said it himself. And then he proposed a policy that carries the exact same structural risk, just with the delivery mechanism changed from an invading army to smuggled rifles. And here is where the timing becomes genuinely important, because Cruz is not just describing a hypothetical strategy. He's criticizing the actual deal currently on the table. The Trump administration, according to multiple reports this week, is angling for a comprehensive agreement with Iran that would include sanctions relief and a proposed $300 billion reconstruction fund aimed at stabilizing the region and giving Tehran an economic off-ramp in exchange for concessions on the Strait of Hormuz, nuclear enrichment limits, and missile range caps. Cruz called that emerging framework a disaster. He called it a terrible deal, and he explained exactly why in blunt terms. You'll forgive me if I'm not terribly eager to give them $300 billion to facilitate their carrying out their stated intent of murdering us. That line is doing a lot of work. Cruz is not just saying the deal is bad economics. He is saying that any deal which strengthens the current Iranian government, even one that ends the shooting war, is fundamentally unacceptable to him because his actual objective was never a ceasefire. His actual objective, in his own words, is regime collapse. That is a meaningfully different goal than the one the administration is currently negotiating toward, and it puts Cruz in direct public opposition to the diplomatic track that his own party's president is pursuing this week in Islamabad and Muscat. There is also a direct connection here to something President Trump himself said earlier in this war, and it is worth pulling that thread because it shows Cruz is not operating in total isolation from the administration's own rhetoric, even if he is now diverging from its current negotiating posture. When the U.S. and Israeli strikes began back in February, the stated goal from the White House was narrow and specific: degrade Iran's conventional military capability and set back its nuclear program. But Trump, in public remarks at the time, also went further than that stated military objective and directly urged ordinary Iranians to take over your government, language that was widely read at the time as an implicit endorsement of internal uprising, even as the official policy remained focused on military targets rather than regime change. So the idea of encouraging Iranian civilians to rise up against their own leadership did not start with Cruz in August. It started with the president himself in the opening days of the war. What has changed is that Trump has since pulled back from that kind of rhetoric as his administration pivoted toward a negotiated settlement, the same $300 billion reconstruction framework Cruz is now publicly trashing. Cruz's podcast appearance, in that light, reads less like a new idea and more like Cruz trying to drag the administration back toward a position it has already quietly abandoned, using the president's own earlier words as leverage against the president's current strategy. It is also worth putting real numbers on what arming the protesters would actually look like if the United States or Israel followed through on it, because vague policy language tends to hide just how large and how uncontrollable an operation like this becomes once it moves from a talking point to an actual supply chain. Iran's population is roughly 90 million people. Even a modest covert arms pipeline capable of meaningfully challenging a regime that commands the IRGC, a force with hundreds of thousands of personnel, its own navy, its own air wing, and an extensive domestic intelligence and surveillance apparatus that has already demonstrated its willingness to kill tens of thousands of its own citizens in a single crackdown would require sustained smuggling routes, safe houses, trusted local distribution networks, and secure communications, all operating inside a country, currently under naval blockade and wartime lockdown. Every one of those logistics nodes is a potential point of exposure, and every exposure risks turning into exactly the kind of incident that either blows up a fragile ceasefire negotiation or hands Iran's hardline faction concrete proof that Washington was never negotiating in good faith. This is not a criticism rooted in squeamishness about supporting people fighting for their own freedom. It is a plain reading of what covert arms pipelines have historically produced in comparable situations, from the Mujahideen pipeline in Afghanistan in the 1980s, which achieved its immediate goal of bleeding the Soviet military, but also seeded weapons and networks that metastasized into groups the United States spent the next 3 decades fighting, to the flow of weapons into Libya after 2011, which helped topple Gaddafi, but then fed directly into the Sahel's ongoing insurgencies as those same weapons and fighters moved south. Cruz, again, acknowledged the Iraq comparison himself on the podcast. He did not acknowledge these other, arguably more directly analogous precedents, where the method he is now proposing, arming an internal population rather than invading with troops, is precisely the model that produced the long-tail chaos. There is a market dimension to all of this too, and it is the piece that connects this story back to something every viewer outside the Middle East actually feels directly, which is the price of fuel. The Strait of Hormuz carried roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade before this war began, and a fifth of global LNG. Every additional week that the blockade, the mining, the shipboardings, and now potentially an internal arms pipeline extend this conflict is another week that global energy markets price in elevated risk. Oil prices have already jumped on separate news of the negotiations either progressing or stalling throughout this war, and a scenario where the current diplomatic track collapses in favor of an open-ended civil conflict inside Iran, rather than a negotiated reopening of the strait, is a scenario energy analysts have flagged as one of the more disruptive outcomes still on the table. Regime collapse, in the clean, fast sense Cruz describes it, might theoretically end the underlying dispute over the strait relatively quickly if a new government simply chose to reopen shipping lanes. But regime collapse achieved through a prolonged internal insurgency, the kind that historically follows when outside powers arm civilian populations against an entrenched security state, is a scenario that could keep the strait contested, mined, and dangerous for years rather than months, which is the opposite of what the oil markets, and frankly, the shipping companies who have already suspended operations in the strait once this year, actually need to see. None of this is to say Cruz's underlying frustration is baseless. The January crackdown that killed somewhere between 12,000 and 30,000 Iranian civilians, depending on which sourcing you use, was a genuine atrocity, and the argument that the international community's response to it was inadequate is a defensible one. Watching a government fire into crowds of its own citizens, and then, months later, watching that same government's foreign ministry sit across the table from American diplomats negotiating a multi-hundred-billion-dollar reconstruction package is, on its face, a difficult thing to reconcile morally. And Cruz is tapping directly into that discomfort when he says he is not eager to hand the regime $300 billion. That is a real tension, and it is one that any negotiated settlement to this war is going to have to sit with. The question is not whether that tension is legitimate. It clearly is. The question is whether the specific mechanism Cruz is proposing to resolve it, funneling weapons into Iranian civilian hands to trigger an armed uprising, actually produces less bloodshed and more stability than the negotiated path currently being pursued in Islamabad and Muscat, or whether it produces a longer, messier, more decentralized version of the same violence, just with American and Israeli fingerprints on the weapons doing the killing on both sides. So where does this actually leave things 6 months into a war that both the blockade numbers and the sanctions numbers suggest is inflicting real measurable damage on Iran's economy? At the exact moment, negotiators say a Hormuz shipping deal could be finalized within days. You have a Trump administration reportedly closing in on a $300 billion reconstruction framework designed to end the war through economic incentives. You have Iran's own government internally split between a diplomatic faction that wants that deal because the economy cannot sustain much more pressure, and a military faction that believes Iran can simply outlast Washington. And now you have a prominent U.S. senator, publicly, on the record, arguing that ending the war through a deal is itself the wrong outcome, that the actual goal should be the collapse of the Iranian government entirely, and that the mechanism to achieve that should be arming Iranian civilians directly, a policy that historically has a track record of producing prolonged internal conflict rather than clean transitions of power. Cruz is not a fringe voice shouting into a podcast microphone with no influence. He sits on the Senate Judiciary Committee, he has run for the Republican presidential nomination, and by his own account, he has already personally lobbied both the sitting president of the United States and the government of Israel on this exact policy repeatedly, not once. Whether or not the administration adopts his framework, the fact that this argument is being made this openly, this publicly, in the same week that a diplomatic deal is reportedly within reach, tells you that the fight over how this war ends is not settled yet, not in Washington, and certainly not inside Tehran. The blockade is still running. The sanctions are still stacking. The mutual defense pact between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan is now signed and active. And a U.S. senator just told the country, on the record, that his preferred ending to this war is not a signature on a diplomatic agreement. It is watching the Iranian government fall from the inside, armed by weapons that came from outside. Whether that is strategy or wishful thinking depends entirely on what happens in the next few weeks in Islamabad, in Muscat, and in whatever rooms Cruz says he has already been making this case in. Cruz also went out of his way in that same conversation to make clear he has no particular successor in mind, which is worth flagging because it undercuts the idea that this is a carefully planned transition rather than a bet on chaos sorting itself out. Pressed by McLean on what comes after collapse, Cruz said, "I don't have a dog in the fight of who the next leader of Iran is. I just want it not to be an Islamist who wants to murder us." He went further in describing the range of options he would personally find acceptable. "I don't have a dog, whether it's the son of the Shah, whether it is the Mojahedin Khalq opposition group, whether it is someone local, as long as they are not an Islamist who hates America and is actively trying to kill Americans." That is a striking admission on its own terms. Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown Prince Cruz referenced, is the son of the Shah overthrown in the 1979 revolution, a figure with essentially no organized domestic political base inside Iran after nearly 5 decades in exile. The Mojahedin Khalq, the other option Cruz named, is an Iranian opposition group with a long and deeply controversial history, one that was actually listed as a foreign terrorist organization by the U.S. State Department for over a decade before being delisted in 2012, and one that many Iran analysts consider to have minimal genuine popular support inside the country itself, in part because of its historical alignment with Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the brutal Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. Cruz naming these two options, alongside a vague third category of someone local, while explicitly saying he does not particularly care which one it ends up being, is not a succession plan. It is a statement that the identity of Iran's next government is a secondary concern behind the primary goal of removing the current one, which is precisely the kind of open-ended commitment that historically produces the longest and bloodiest power vacuums, because no outside power sponsoring the collapse has actually agreed internally or with each other on who should fill it. It is also worth noting that this is not the first time Cruz has said something close to this. He was calling for the regime's removal as far back as March, 3 weeks into the war, telling Fox News host Jesse Waters that the opening strikes had been incredibly successful, and that Iran's Ayatollah had twice hired hitmen in attempts to kill President Trump, a claim Cruz has repeated across multiple interviews as his central justification for treating this as an existential fight, rather than a containable dispute. He made a similar case that same month to the Iran international outlet's Eye for Iran podcast, saying flatly, "Yeah, I believe this regime needs to be removed from power," and arguing that a coalition of Iran's own regional adversaries was effectively building itself as a byproduct of Tehran's own military responses. And in prepared remarks for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Cruz explicitly framed his preferred approach around Cold War precedent, telling that audience the United States should pursue Iran's collapse the way it once pursued the collapse of the Soviet Union, through sustained, patient, multi-decade pressure rather than a single decisive strike. What is new in this week's comments is not the underlying goal, which Cruz has been consistent about since March. What is new is the specific operational detail that he has, in his own words, repeatedly and directly urged both the President of the United States and the government of Israel to physically arm Iranian civilians, and that he is saying so publicly at the exact moment a negotiated deal is reportedly close enough to sign that Iran's own state media is running near-daily updates on the Oman shipping talks. Because it is the detail that actually ties the entire story together. Cruz did not make these comments on the Senate floor, and he did not make them in a formal committee hearing where they would be entered into the record with the usual caveats and pushback built into that setting. He made them in a long-form conversation on an independent podcast, the same format, incidentally, that has become the primary venue for this entire generation of foreign policy debate, precisely because it allows a sitting senator to lay out a position this blunt, this unfiltered, without the guardrails of a traditional press conference. That matters because it means Cruz's regime collapse comment is not a slip of the tongue or an off-the-cuff answer to a hostile reporter's question. It was said deliberately at length to a national security specialist who pushed him to explain the mechanics, and Cruz walked through those mechanics without hesitation. He knew exactly what he was proposing, and he knew exactly how it would be received. That is not the profile of a politician testing a message. That is the profile of a politician who believes the current administration's negotiating strategy is heading toward a mistake big enough that he's willing to publicly break with it in detail, while the ink on a potential Hormuz agreement is still wet. Cruz is also not a lone voice on this inside his own party, and understanding how wide this GOP revolt actually runs helps explain why his comments this week carry more weight than a single senator's opinion. When the original 14-point memorandum of understanding was first unveiled back in mid-June, the backlash from inside the Republican conference was immediate and unusually sharp for a deal negotiated by a Republican administration. Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy, one of the most direct critics, wrote on social media that Reagan is rolling over in his grave, calling the agreement the worst foreign policy blunder in decades. Cassidy's arithmetic was blunt and, frankly, hard to argue with on its face. Before the war began, the Strait was open, Iran was under crushing sanctions, and 13 American service members were alive. By the time that first memorandum was signed, Cassidy pointed out, those same 13 service members were dead. American families had absorbed billions of dollars in higher pump prices from the disrupted oil trade, and the deal on the table was set to lift sanctions and hand Tehran a $300 billion reconstruction commitment anyway. Cassidy was not alone. CBS News reported that Senators Tom Tillis and Tom Cotton joined Cassidy and Cruz in publicly criticizing that same memorandum the week it was announced, meaning 4 sitting Republican senators broke from their own president's negotiating team within days of the deal's release. Cassidy went further in follow-up remarks, warning that the agreement would leave Iran stronger and America's regional allies weaker, and argued that Tehran had essentially learned it could hold the global economy hostage through the Strait and extract concessions anytime it wanted, because the credible threat of consequences for closing it again had, in his words, been exhausted by this president's willingness to negotiate rather than hold firm. Not every Republican senator lined up against the deal, though. Lindsey Graham, who has otherwise taken a hawkish line on Iran throughout this war, actually struck a notably different tone after speaking directly with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, saying he believed signing the memorandum would be beneficial specifically because it would begin reopening the strait and halting hostilities, and that he saw little downside to trying. That split, Cruz and Cassidy pushing for collapse and confrontation, Graham cautiously backing the negotiating track, is the same fault line running through the party right now that Cruz's comments this week reopened. And it is worth noting that the original memorandum Cassidy tore apart in June did not even hold. It collapsed by mid-July after fighting resumed, which means the very outcome Cassidy warned about in real time, an agreement that would not actually curb the underlying conflict, ended up playing out almost exactly as he predicted. And it is precisely that failed first attempt at diplomacy that the current Islamabad and Muscat talks are now trying to succeed where the June deal did not. It also helps to understand exactly how bad the economic backdrop is inside Iran right now, because that backdrop is the entire reason this debate over collapse versus negotiation has any real force to begin with. The protests that first pushed Cruz to call for arming demonstrators back in January did not start over the war. They started over money. In the final days of December 2025, shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar shut their stalls in protest as the rial collapsed to a record low on the open market. And within days, the unrest had spread to all 31 of Iran's provinces, including regions historically considered loyal to the clerical government. The numbers behind that anger are staggering. The International Monetary Fund's own World Economic Outlook projected Iran's economy would shrink by 6.1% in 2026, with inflation running near 68.9%, while Iran's own central bank reported a 12-month inflation rate of 53.7% through the end of March, and point-to-point inflation on all goods hitting 73.5%. Food prices alone rose an average of 72% year over year. The rial, which traded at roughly 700,000 to the dollar in January 2025, had collapsed to around 1.47 million to the dollar by January 2026, and continued sliding from there, forcing Iran's central bank to introduce its largest ever currency note, a 10 million rial bill, just weeks after putting a 5 million rial note into circulation for the first time. Nearly 1 in 5 young Iranians is unemployed. And because Iran has not published official GDP figures since 2024, and because a widespread internet blackout has made domestic economic data even harder to verify from outside the country, most of what the outside world knows about how badly this is hurting ordinary Iranians comes from scattered reporting, black market exchange rates, and the protests themselves, which have never fully stopped, only ebbed and resurged. As recently as July 12th, in the middle of a heat wave with temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius, retirees and ordinary citizens in Shush and Kermanshah were still marching, chanting lines that translate roughly to "warmongering is enough," "our tables are empty," and "inflation and high prices, no to war and destruction." That is the population Cruz wants to arm. Not a hypothetical, ideologically unified pro-democracy movement, but an exhausted, economically desperate population that is angry primarily about empty dinner tables and a collapsing currency. A population where, according to reporting from those very first December protests, some demonstrators were already chanting support for exiled royal figure Reza Pahlavi, even as others simply wanted subsidies restored and prices to stabilize. That is not a single coherent movement with a shared political endpoint. It is closer to a pressure cooker with several different, sometimes contradictory grievances, venting at once, which is exactly the kind of population that historically fractures into competing factions the moment outside weapons start flowing in, rather than uniting cleanly behind one post-collapse government. On one screen, diplomats in Islamabad and Muscat are reportedly closing in on a shipping lane arrangement that could formally end the maritime portion of this war within days, backed by a reconstruction package, designed to give Tehran an economic reason to hold up its end of the bargain. On the other screen, a sitting U.S. senator who has already, by his own account, personally lobbied both the president and the Israeli government to arm Iranian civilians, is now saying publicly that ending the war through that kind of deal is the wrong outcome entirely, that the fighting should continue, the pressure should intensify, and the actual objective should be watching the Islamic Republic collapse from the inside. Those two tracks cannot both be the operative American strategy at the same time. One of them is going to win out in the coming weeks, and the other is going to be the road not taken, the version of this war's ending that gets written about in hindsight, as the one Washington almost chose instead. This is John. I'll see you in the next one.